The Verdask 7 jungle had a perfect record, 100% mortality rate, not mostly fatal or extremely dangerous or any of those wimpy qualifiers that still left room for some lucky idiot to survive. No, every single explorer who'd entered that hellscape had died. 43 expeditions across 17 different species and 43 sets of remains that had to be retrieved by heavily armed recovery teams wearing enough protective gear to make them look like mobile bunkers. The Interstellar Exploration Guild had even erected a monument, a big, expensive one made of crystallized neutron matter that would outlast most stars. It listed every name, every species, every date of demise. The inscription read, "They ventured where wisdom feared to tread," which was a poetic way of saying these morons ignored every red flag in existence and paid the price. Smart species looked at Verdask 7 and thought, you know what, some places aren't meant for visiting. They'd scan it from orbit, catalogue its horrors from a safe distance, and move on with their lives. This was called having a functioning survival instinct. Humans, apparently, hadn't gotten that memo. Verdask 7 wasn't just hostile. Hostile implied some level of indifference, like the universe simply didn't care whether you lived or died. Verdask 7 actively wanted you dead. The jungle canopy was so dense that it blocked 98% of sunlight, creating a permanent twilight that messed with circadian rhythms and made navigation a nightmare. The humidity hung at 97%, thick enough to feel like breathing through wet cloth, making it impossible to keep anything dry. The flora was carnivorous, not some of it, all of it. Every vine, every flower, every moss-covered rock was just waiting for something warm-blooded to stumble close enough. The Keltharian expedition had lost 3 members to what they thought were harmless ferns. Turned out those ferns had root systems that could sense body heat from 20 meters away and enough tensile strength to crush a transport shuttle. The fauna was worse. 6-legged predators called razor storks that could smell fear pheromones from kilometers away, swarms of acid-spitting insects that worked in coordinated hunting patterns that would make military tacticians weep with envy, and something the previous explorers had only documented in terrified final transmissions, shadows that moved wrong, that didn't match any biological classification, that simply absorbed whatever touched them. The Thoraxian expedition had lasted 18 hours. They were a species evolved from apex predators, covered in natural armor plating that could withstand plasma fire. The jungle had dissolved them. The Crimori, who could survive in temperatures ranging from near absolute zero to the surface of a star, had frozen to death somehow. The jungle's ambient temperature was a comfortable 23 degrees Celsius, which made their demise scientifically baffling and existentially terrifying. After the 16th failed expedition, the Guild had declared Verdask 7 off-limits. Class X prohibited zone, career-ending penalties for even approaching the planet without explicit authorization. They'd installed automated defense satellites that would politely but firmly redirect anyone who got too close. After the 31st failed expedition, launched by a splinter group of academic daredevils, they'd upgraded those satellites to weapons platforms. The scientific consensus was clear. Verdask 7 was where exploration went to die. Its secrets, if it had any, would remain buried under layers of carnivorous vegetation and existential dread. Anyone who wanted to study it could do so from orbit, using drones that had a life expectancy of roughly 4 minutes once they penetrated the canopy. This was accepted wisdom, established fact, universal truth. Then a human read the file and said, "Yeah, but has anyone tried being competent?" His name was Dane Okoye, and he had the kind of confidence that made risk assessment specialists develop stress-related disorders. He'd walked into the Exploration Guild's orbital station above Verdask 7, slapped down an application for solo expedition authorization, and smiled like someone who hadn't just requested permission to commit suicide. The Vraxian administrator, whose species was known for having 4 separate brains that could process information in parallel, had stared at the application for a full minute, all 4 brains working overtime. Then she'd looked at Dane and said, "You understand this planet has killed everyone who's set foot on it." "I read the file," Dane had replied. "Sounds like none of them knew what they were doing. The Keltharians are considered the finest survival specialists in this sector." And yet, Dane had gestured vaguely downward, toward the planet. Dead. The administrator's secondary brain had started pulsing in a way that indicated either deep thought or an impending aneurysm. The Guild cannot authorize this. The liability alone would bankrupt 3 stellar systems. Good thing I brought my own insurance. Dane had produced a legal document that somehow absolved everyone involved of responsibility for his impending demise. It had been notarized by a human lawyer who specialized in adventurous idiocy cases and was apparently getting rich off her species' collective death wish. Word spread fast. Within 6 hours, every species with a presence in the sector knew that a human was going to Vardask 7. The betting pools formed immediately. Not whether he'd survive. Everyone agreed that was impossible. The bets were on how long he'd last. The Keltharians, still bitter about losing their best team, put money on 4 hours. The Thoraxians said 12, citing humanity's apparent inability to recognize danger. The Cremori, who rarely gambled, broke tradition and bet 30 minutes, specifically citing that humans were soft, weak, and far too confident for their own evolutionary good. One Vraxian analyst, the same administrator who'd processed his application, quietly put money on 72 hours. When asked why, she'd said, "I've worked with humans before. They're either the stupidest species in the galaxy or the most brilliant, and there's no middle ground. I'm hedging my bets." The over-under on Dane's survival time was 8 hours and 37 minutes. The prize pool reached 3 million credits within a day. Dane, for his part, seemed blissfully unaware that his death had become a spectator sport. He spent 2 days reviewing every failed expedition report, cross-referencing environmental data, and buying supplies from the station's general store. Nothing fancy. Basic camping gear, some tools, emergency beacon that everyone knew would be useless once the jungle's interference kicked in, and roughly 200 kilograms of what appeared to be random garbage. "What's the plastic sheeting for?" someone had asked. "Shelter," Dane had said. "The chemical compounds, fire, the seeds, lunch." Then he'd loaded everything into a drop pod, strapped himself in, and launched toward the surface with a cheerfulness that seemed almost offensive given the circumstances. The last thing he'd said before atmospheric entry cut off communications was, "See you in a month." Everyone assumed he meant they'd see his corpse. The recovery team started prepping. The drop pod hit the canopy, like a meteorite punching through tissue paper. Layers of carnivorous vegetation that had evolved to trap and consume anything falling from above met humanity's solution to atmospheric entry, a reinforced titanium shell moving at terminal velocity with all the grace of a dropped anvil. The jungle didn't appreciate the interruption. By the time the pod crashed through to the forest floor, leaving a tunnel of shredded plant matter and very angry flora in its wake, proximity sensors were already screaming warnings. Vines were converging on the impact site. The acid spitters were swarming. Something large and presumably hungry was making the ground vibrate with heavy footfalls. Dane popped the hatch, looked around at the twilight hellscape of reaching vines and dripping fangs, and said, "Cozy." The first vine that reached for him got a machete through its central nervous cluster. The second got doused in concentrated capsaicin extract, which turned out to be just as effective on alien plant life as it was on Earth mammals. The vine recoiled so fast, it actually made a sound, a shrieking whistle that echoed through the canopy. The acid spitters arrived 30 seconds later. Dane was ready with mosquito netting that had been treated with a compound that smelled to insect analog senses like death itself. The swarm hit the perimeter, recoiled, and decided that whatever was in that pod wasn't worth the trouble. The something large and hungry emerged from the undergrowth 2 minutes after that. It had 6 legs, 4 eyes, and enough teeth to stock a dental supply warehouse. It took one look at Dane, who was standing on top of his pod holding a flare bright enough to cause temporary blindness, and made a decision that probably saved its life. It left. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Dane muttered, and got to work. The monitoring satellites, which had been repositioned to observe the human's inevitable demise, were sending back data that was causing confusion at the orbital station. The human was moving with purpose, efficiently. He wasn't panicking, wasn't running blindly, wasn't making any of the mistakes that had doomed previous expeditions. He was clearing space, creating a perimeter using a combination of chemical deterrents, physical barriers, and what appeared to be psychological warfare against the local ecosystem. When vines tried to creep back into his cleared zone, they encountered tripwires connected to bells made from the drop pod's excess plating. The noise drove them back. When predators attempted to investigate, they found the entire area reeking of chemical signatures that screamed danger in a language that transcended species. By nightfall, which in the permanent twilight of the jungle was more of a slightly darker than before situation, Dane had established a base camp that would have made survival instructors weep with joy. Shelter constructed from the plastic sheeting and local materials, a water collection system using condensation traps, food stores secured in a suspended cache that nothing ground-based could reach, and fire. Everyone knew fire was impossible in the Verdask 7 jungle. The humidity was too high, the wood was too saturated. The Keltharians had tried and failed. The chemical composition of the atmosphere itself seemed to resist combustion. Dane had fire burning in a carefully constructed pit, using a combination of chemical accelerants, processed plant fibers that he'd somehow dried using body heat and mechanical compression, and sheer bloody-minded determination. The flames were small, carefully controlled, and absolutely shouldn't have existed. The jungle seemed confused. The predators kept their distance. The carnivorous plants redirected their attention elsewhere. And Dane Okoye sat by his impossible fire, eating a meal of processed rations, and marked day 1 in his log with a simple note, "Not dead yet." Jungle seemed surprised. The orbital station's monitoring room had become a 24-hour operation. Scientists and analysts from a dozen species crowded around displays showing Dane's vitals, environmental readings, and video feeds that updated whenever the satellite had line of sight through the canopy. The human was thriving, in the planet that had killed 43 expeditions. Day 2, he'd expanded his perimeter, used controlled burns to clear additional space, which shouldn't have worked because controlled burns required things that could actually burn. The jungle's plant life had adapted over millennia to resist fire. It was too wet, too resilient. Dane had adapted faster. He'd identified specific plants that had higher oil content, harvested them, processed them into something flammable, and created fire breaks that the jungle couldn't cross. When the carnivorous vines tried to bridge the gaps, they encountered barriers laced with compounds that made them think twice. "He's terraforming," a Vraxian ecologist had whispered, watching the feeds, in real time, without proper equipment. Day 3, the shelter had upgraded from adequate to comfortable. Dane had incorporated local materials, weaving them into the structure in ways that actually reinforced the integrity. He'd discovered that certain plant fibers, when dried and treated, became incredibly strong. The same plants that had tried to kill him were now protecting him from the elements. The irony wasn't lost on the observers. The fire had become a permanent fixture. Dane kept it burning continuously, using it for warmth, cooking, water purification, and apparently psychological comfort. He'd even created a chimney system using hollowed plant stalks, directing smoke up and away from the camp in a way that didn't attract predators. "Fire requires 3 things," a Keltharian survival instructor had said, analyzing the footage: fuel, oxygen, and heat. The humidity should make sustained combustion impossible. The ambient temperature is too low for spontaneous ignition. The available fuel is too saturated. This violates thermodynamics. "Maybe human thermodynamics work differently," someone had suggested. "That's not how thermodynamics work." Day 4, Dane had started experimenting with local flora, not just avoiding the carnivorous plants, but studying them. He'd collected samples, tested them carefully, and discovered something that made the xenobotanists lose their collective minds. Some of the plants were edible, not all of them. Most would kill you in creative ways, but a few species, when properly processed, provided nutrients. The processing was key. Raw, they were toxic. Cooked, still toxic. But Dane had discovered that a specific combination of heating, cooling, and exposure to compounds from other plants neutralized the toxins. He was creating recipes for food. On a death world, the betting pools were in chaos. Dane had passed the 72-hour mark. The Vraxian administrator, who'd bet on him, was looking smug. Day 5, the satellite feed showed something that made everyone stop and stare. Dane had planted seeds, the ones he'd brought with him from the station. He'd cleared a small plot, treated the soil with composted local materials, and carefully planted earth vegetables in alien dirt. "He's gardening," someone said, voice flat with disbelief. on Verdask 7, where 43 expeditions died. He's gardening. The human apparently had long-term plans. The seeds wouldn't sprout for days, maybe weeks. He was betting on being alive long enough to harvest them. More than that, he was confident enough in his survival to invest time and effort into agricultural projects. The jungle continued its attempts at murder, but they were becoming less enthusiastic. Predators that had initially shown interest now gave his camp a wide berth. The carnivorous plants had learned that the cleared zone meant danger. Even the weird shadows that didn't match biological classification seemed to be avoiding the area. Dane, for his part, had established a routine: wake up, maintain the fire, check the perimeter, gather resources, improve the shelter, experiment with food sources, document everything, sleep, repeat. It was almost boring in its efficiency. The orbital station's communications officer had started receiving requests from across the sector. Everyone wanted updates. The human survival had become the most watched event in recent history. Scientific journals were preparing papers. The Exploration Guild was having emergency meetings about revising planetary classifications. And Dane Okoye, completely unaware that he'd become a galactic sensation, was sitting by his fire on day 5 evening, roasting something that looked disturbingly like a cross between a mushroom and a squid, writing in his log, "Local cuisine takes some getting used to. Missing pizza. Might try to make bread when the wheat sprouts. If the wheat sprouts, this planet might just hate grain on principle." Day 12, Dane found the grove. He'd been expanding his exploration radius carefully, never venturing so far that he couldn't make it back to camp before dark. The jungle beyond his cleared zone was still lethal, still actively hostile, but he'd learned its patterns: when the razor stalks hunted, where the acid spitters nested, which plants were only mostly carnivorous versus extremely carnivorous. The grove was hidden behind a wall of the most aggressive vegetation he'd encountered, the kind that didn't just wait for prey to stumble close, but actively reached out to grab anything warm-blooded. Previous expeditions had probably hit that wall and either died or turned back. Dane had looked at it and thought, yeah, but why is it guarding this specific area? Things that needed guarding were usually worth finding. He'd spent 3 days creating a path, not cutting through directly, which would have been suicide, but carefully redirecting the plant growth using chemicals, controlled burns, and strategic pruning. He'd essentially negotiated with the jungle, convincing it that this particular corridor wasn't worth defending. When he finally pushed through the final barrier, he'd found paradise in the middle of hell. The grove was roughly 200 meters in diameter, a perfect circle of relatively gentle vegetation. The canopy here was thinner, allowing actual sunlight to penetrate. Real sunlight, not the filtered twilight that covered the rest of the jungle. There was a freshwater spring bubbling up from underground, creating a small pool that wasn't trying to dissolve anything, and fruit, actual honest-to-God fruit, hanging from trees that weren't carnivorous. Dane had stood there for a full minute, just staring. Then he'd laughed. Long, loud, and with enough genuine amusement that the satellite feed picked it up clearly. "You absolute bastard of a planet," he'd said to the jungle at large. "You've got an oasis hidden in here and you've been killing everyone before they could find it." The fruit, when tested carefully, was non-toxic, nutritious even, high in sugars and vitamins that humans needed. The water was clean. The entire grove existed like a bubble of livability in an ocean of death. Over the next week, Dane had done something that made the xenobiologists watching from orbit question their careers. He'd started cultivating the grove, not just harvesting the existing fruit, but actively encouraging growth. He'd pruned dead branches, cleared invasive plants that were creeping in from the hostile jungle, established a composting system using waste materials. He'd also started transplanting, taking cuttings from the grove's fruit trees and attempting to propagate them near his base camp. It shouldn't have worked. The grove's ecosystem was clearly unique, probably sustained by specific soil conditions and the underground spring. Moving plants outside that environment should have killed them. Dane's cuttings were thriving. He'd somehow reverse-engineered the grove's soil composition using nothing but observation, experimentation, and what appeared to be sheer audacity. He was creating a secondary grove around his camp. The earth seeds he'd planted had sprouted. Wheat, tomatoes, beans, growing in alien soil that should have rejected them. He was watering them with treated jungle water, fertilizing them with composted local materials, protecting them from predators using barriers and deterrents. He was farming on Verdusk 7, the planet that had killed 43 expeditions. Day 23. The satellite feed showed Dane sitting in his expanded camp, surrounded by growing crops, eating fruit from the grove, maintaining his eternal fire, writing detailed notes about sustainable agricultural practices in hostile environments. The betting pools had closed. Everyone who'd bet against his survival had lost. The Vraxian administrator, who'd believed in the 72-hour survival window, had won enough credits to retire. The Exploration Guild was in emergency session. They'd declared Verdusk 7 Class X prohibited because it was unsurvivable. But here was a human, not just surviving, but apparently establishing a homestead. Their classification system couldn't handle this. Nothing in their protocols covered Death World that's actually livable if you're not a coward about it. Day 28. Dane activated his emergency beacon, not because he was in distress. The signal was steady, calm, carrying a simple message: mission complete, ready for pickup, bringing samples. The orbital station's communications erupted into chaos. He was alive. He was ready to come home. He had samples. The recovery team that launched wasn't heavily armed or wearing bunker-grade protective gear. They were scientists, agriculturalists, ecologists, all desperate to understand what the human had accomplished. When they reached the landing coordinates, they'd found Dane waiting beside his drop pod. He'd packed up his camp, harvested fruit from both the grove and his cultivated plants, carefully preserved samples of every food source he'd discovered, and compiled detailed documentation of everything he'd learned. He'd also built a small shelter near the grove, maintaining the fire, leaving instructions carved into treated wood about water sources, edible plants, and dangerous wildlife patterns, a guide for future explorers. Just in case someone else wants to visit, he'd explained. The shuttle ride back to the orbital station was tense, not because of danger, but because Dane was sitting there looking completely fine, while scientists from multiple species tried to process what they were seeing. He wasn't traumatized, wasn't injured beyond minor scrapes that had already healed, wasn't showing signs of psychological stress or environmental damage. He looked like someone returning from a successful camping trip, not someone who'd just survived a month on a planet that had a perfect kill record. The Vraxian administrator who'd processed his original application was waiting in the docking bay. She'd spent the last month watching the feeds, winning obscene amounts of money from betting pools, and questioning everything she thought she knew about planetary habitability. "You survived," she said when Dane disembarked. "I know," Dane replied, grinning. "Surprised me too." "That's a lie. You knew you'd survive." "Well, yeah, but I figured saying that would sound arrogant." The samples he'd brought back created an immediate sensation. The fruit was analyzed and found to be not just edible, but nutritious for multiple species. The cultivation methods he'd documented could theoretically be applied to other hostile environments. The shelter designs were efficient, using minimal materials for maximum protection. The fire was what broke everyone's brains. "How did you maintain combustion in 97% humidity?" a Keltharian scientist demanded, holding up Dane's documentation like it contained forbidden knowledge. "Proper fuel preparation, controlled airflow and patience," Dane said. "You just need to understand that wet things can burn if you're stubborn enough. That's not science. And yet I had fire for 28 days straight." The Guild convened an emergency session to re-evaluate Verdusk 7's classification. They couldn't keep it Class X prohibited when a human had just proven it was survivable, but they couldn't classify it as safe because it had still killed 43 expeditions. The compromise was awkward. Class X prohibited, except for humans, apparently. Academic institutions across the sector requested interviews. Survival schools wanted to hire Dane as an instructor. The Keltharians, swallowing considerable pride, asked if he'd be willing to review their training protocols. "Your people are fine," Dane told them. "You're just too careful. Sometimes survival isn't about having the best gear or the most training. It's about being willing to try stupid things and learn from what doesn't kill you. That's insane. I know, but I have fruit from a death world, so maybe insanity works." The crops he'd planted were still growing in the jungle. The grove remained protected. The shelter stood as a testament to human stubbornness. Verdansk 7 was still hostile, still dangerous, still more than capable of killing anyone who underestimated it. But it wasn't unbeatable, not if you approached it with intelligence, adaptability, and the kind of confidence that looked like stupidity right up until it worked. 3 months after Dane's return, the Exploration Guild made Verdansk 7 available for limited expeditions, humans only. Other species could apply for special permits if accompanied by a human guide who'd completed hostile environment certification. The certification program was designed by Dane. It mostly involved teaching people how to identify edible plants, maintain fire in terrible conditions, and negotiate with environments that wanted them dead. The passing rate was 17%. Most species gave up after the first module about working with carnivorous flora instead of against it. The grove became a way station. Explorers who made it that far could resupply, rest, and actually enjoy being on the planet for brief periods. The fruit trees Dane had cultivated near his original base camp had spread, creating multiple small safe zones throughout the jungle. Verdansk 7's perfect kill record was broken. Not just broken, shattered. Humans were establishing research stations, agricultural test sites, long-term habitation experiments. The planet that had been a monument to the limits of exploration was becoming a poster child for humanity's refusal to accept limits. The memorial to the 43 failed expeditions remained. The Guild added a new inscription beneath the original: "They ventured where wisdom feared to tread." Then a human brought fire, fruit, and blueprints. Dane Okoye, for his part, had already moved on to his next project. There was a Class X ocean world that had drowned 12 expeditions. Everyone said it was unsurvivable. The pressure was too extreme, the currents too violent, the marine life too aggressive. Dane read the file and said, "Yeah, but has anyone tried building a submarine?" The betting pools opened immediately. The over-under on his survival time was 2 weeks. The Vraxian administrator who'd believed in him once put money on 6 months, specifically noting, "At some point we need to accept that humans don't play by the same rules as everyone else." Somewhere in the administrative halls of the Exploration Guild, someone updated the official guidance on planetary classifications. Under the section about determining habitability factors, a new footnote appeared. Note: if a human claims something is survivable, do not immediately dismiss this claim, regardless of contradictory data. Humans have a documented history of being wrong about impossibility. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. When every logical analysis says something cannot be done, when all evidence points toward failure, when the smartest minds conclude that survival is impossible, there's still one variable that calculations cannot account for: human stubbornness armed with basic camping supplies and an aggressive disinterest in dying. Verdansk 7 still killed the unwary, still punished the unprepared, still deserved its fearsome reputation. But its perfect record was gone, broken by a species that looked at a monument to the dead and thought, skill issue. The jungle, if it was capable of such things, probably felt a mixture of respect and profound annoyance. It had spent millennia perfecting the art of murder, only to have some bipedal mammal show up with plastic sheeting and basic chemistry knowledge and ruin everything. Somewhere in the depths of that hostile paradise, the fire Dane had started still burned, maintained by researchers who'd taken up residence, fueled by properly processed plant matter, defying the humidity through sheer human spite. It had become a symbol, not of conquest but of adaptation, not of domination but of coexistence. The galaxy watched and learned. Not all of them would venture to Verdansk 7. Most species remained sensibly terrified of death worlds. But they understood now that impossible was a word humans heard as challenge accepted. And really, that explained so much about humanity's trajectory through the stars. Give them a problem that cannot be solved, and they'd solve it out of pure spite. Tell them somewhere was unsurvivable, and they'd return with agriculture. Show them a monument to the dead, and they'd use it as a camping guide. The universe was vast, full of wonders and terrors beyond comprehension. But perhaps the most terrifying thing in it wasn't the hostile planets or the carnivorous jungles or the perfect kill records. It was the human ability to look at certain death and ask, "But have you considered I might just not die?" 43 expeditions had proven Verdansk 7 was lethal. One human had proven that lethality was negotiable. The betting pools for Dane's ocean world adventure were already climbing into the millions. Nobody was betting on whether he'd survive anymore. They were betting on what impossible thing he'd make look easy this time. Smart money was on him returning with sushi.